Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Texas Science Festival session, The Science of Love, with Lisa Neff and Steve Phelps. We're really glad to have you here with us. My name is Allison Preston, and I'm the Vice President for Research at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as a faculty member in the departments of Neuroscience and Psychology. So today we have a very exciting set of brief talks. We'll be bridging disciplines with two scientists who present their work on a topic that's central to the human experience, love. So please note that all audience members will be muted and without the use of their webcams for the duration of the webinar. As one of our Science Sparks events, we're going to start with a set of 10-minute talks by each speaker. And after each talk, we'll have a brief Q&A period. So to ask a question to our speakers, please use your Q&A feature by hovering over the bottom center of your screen at any time. You can use that feature to submit questions, and then that will ask our speakers to answer. And then I know many of you submitted pre-submitted questions, and so we'll get to as many of those as we can as well. And so to start off our Science Sparks events, I'd like to introduce Steve Phelps. Steve is a professor of integrative biology and the director of UT Austin Center for Brain, Behavior, and Evolution, and he's the president-elect of the Society for Social Neuroscience. And Steve also was recently selected as a Guggenheim Fellow for his work on the topic we'll hear about today. So Steve, we're excited to hear about your research on love.
Thank you so much, Allison. It's really a delight to be here today and an honor to be sharing some of our work with everyone here as part of this really wonderful series. I'm going to, if I'll call up my video just for a moment here. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about how our brains form bonds, right? And what the significance is of bonding in the realm of biology. And this is, obviously a research interest of mine, but it's also a much broader interest. I think that it's something that we can all relate to. I'm talking to you today from Gainesville, Florida. I happen to be here for work, but I used to live here, and it's here in Gainesville that I met my husband 14 years ago. And I can remember this day, not only where it is we met, but where in the room we were both seated, the layout of the restaurant where we met with some mutual friends, the path to come in. And I mention this because not only are we talking about love, but if you love somebody, and probably most of you do, um, you may have a very similar memory yourself. So 14 years later, I remember these incredible details about those events in a way that really kind of speaks to how special those relationships are and the capacity of our brains to sort of grab onto that information and hold it and recognize it as something that's worth keeping track of. So, what do we know about the biology of love or the biology of bonding? Uh, well, in the animal, in terms of work on animals, it really kind of begins with the study of bonding and courtship behaviors in birds. And there was a really foundational animal behaviorist who really helped initiate the scientific study of animal behavior. And his name was Julian Huxley. He did quite a variety of things, but this is one of the things he's most known for. And he did this fantastic study in 1914 of the crested grebe, and documented the courtship behaviors and um, defined all kinds of positions they assumed, the pear-shaped attitude, the cat attitude, their behaviors he called the weed trick here on the left, and the display known as the ghostly penguin, my favorite. But when he was looking at these, he was just struck by the sense that there was something kind of emotional about the nature of their behavior. He writes, I was thus much against my preconceived ideas, driven to think of all the complicated postures and evolutions of courtship and grebes as merely an expression of emotions. And he challenges us to think about something as as he challenges us to think about bonding and emotions. Sorry, he challenges us to think about the courtship of these birds with by making an analogy to a human kiss and how it feels almost inevitable. Um, so, in the wake of his work, came a young ethologist, Conrad Lorenz, who would later in his career then start to study bonding and attachment during development. And he looked at the gray lag geese. Gray lag geese are interesting because they leave the nest very early and they have a very short window to learn the identity of their parents. So they form attachments with the first thing that moves in their field of vision. And he was able to take advantage of this and raise these chicks himself. And they imprinted on him. Here you see Lorenz with his geese in the water as they follow him about. So Lorenz gave us the sense that these behaviors in animals, and by extension in humans as well, are not are somehow shaped by natural selection and attuned to their environment. In this case, the developmental style of these geese. And he suggested that behavior patterns um, are formed by the brain, and the brain has been shaped by natural selection. And so, if we take this kind of perspective and apply it to animal bonds and think about bonds in the animal kingdom, we see that bonds in general serve some sort of purpose. One purpose often is in the care of young. So males and females form bonds because in many circumstances it's difficult to raise young without forming bonds. Here's a dramatic example of that. This poison frog. This is a male, and he's got a little tadpole on his back. What's he doing with that tadpole? Well, he's going to take it to a bromeliad up in the canopy of the forest. He's going to deposit that tadpole in a safe little pool of water where there are no predators and there are a handful of bugs and things for the tadpole to eat. But there's always the risk that the tadpole is going to run out of food. So he comes back to check on it every few days. And if the tadpole's out of food, then he's going to call. And who comes to his call? It's his mate here in the lower left. So his mate will come up. And what she'll do is she'll lay unfertilized eggs for the tadpole to eat. So the bond in this case is this attachment between a male and a female frog in which they're sharing the care of young. So these kinds of pair bonds are common, and they're often tied to the rearing of young. And then on top of that, of course, there are the bonds between parents and young. We see other kinds of bonds. Of course, there are bonds among kin, bonds among that look like friendships. These are geladas, which are a type of primate, and they groom obsessively with one another. Their grooming helps with hygiene, but it also helps to develop and maintain bonds. These bonds can contribute to coalitions. The primatologist Archie describes a female gelada grooming higher-ranking females, working her way up the social ladder until eventually she leads a coalition to depose the alpha female. So these bonds have functions, even when they're friendships, and certainly we know that in our own life, in our own lives. This is an orangutan. This is one of the great apes. And one of the interesting things about the orangutan is the fact that they don't really form bonds, and so they're relatively closely related to us, and yet they don't have the same drive for connection that we and many other primates have. And so it's not necessarily the case that all the smart animals of the world form attachments, but these attachments really generally are bent towards some function. So given that we form attachments, it kind of suggests that maybe there's some function to those attachments. So when Huxley talked about the grebes, he said, it's almost like the way we feel when we have a kiss, that it feels almost inevitable. It's this kind of emotional response. And he challenged us to think about these behaviors or familiar behaviors in kind of a unique way or from a different perspective and think about really why they're there. Um, and I'll suggest that a bond is a kind of pact between two brains. It's an agreement to share life's risks and opportunities. And those include caring for young, those include social interactions, those include just navigating the opportunities and risks presented by the natural world. Well, if we want to study how bonds form, it's useful to study something where we can look at brains. And so much of the work on that on understanding how bonds form really is focused on this little rodent called the prairie vole. And the prairie vole is a small Midwestern rodent that is famous for its family values. It lives in the Midwest, and males and females form bonds that last through their lives. They raise young together, they share a nest together. They even exhibit empathy like behavior in that if a mate is distressed, you can detect the increase in stress uh, of their partner. Um, when we looked into the brains of prairie voles, we meaning scientists more generally, this work predates my entry into the field. Uh, what we learned was that one particularly important set of brain regions for forming bonds are regions that are related to reward. When we talk about love, we often talk about it as like an addiction, and that's very much true biologically. We find these same brain regions that are important for addiction, for food reward, for sex reward, are the same regions that are important for forming bonds in the prairie voles, and not just the prairie voles. The prairie voles led us to look back to our own brains. And so this is an old study now from 2005 looking at brain activity in undergraduates who've been asked, how much do you love your partner? And then they rate that love on a numeric scale. And then they scan their brains and they're looking at a picture of their partner. And what they find is that there's a network of brain regions, something called the nucleus accumbens and the ventral pallidum, that are both influenced by another brain region called the ventral tegmental area. You don't need to remember these, but the ventral tegmental area releases a compound that's famous in reward called dopamine. You've probably heard of dopamine, or you've possibly heard of dopamine. Dopamine is really important for shaping reward. And we see these same brain regions light up in the context of considering loved ones in humans. So work from prairie voles has directly influenced how we view um, the human brain and the human functions of love. So in my own lab, one of the things we're doing now is taking a similar kind of fMRI approach, but one in which we're looking at a much finer scale. We're able to visualize in the prairie vole brain nerve cells that were recently active. And we can visualize them and see just exactly where in the brain things are changing as prairie voles form in love. So this little video I'm showing you now is a heat map showing all the little parts of the vole brain that are coming on specifically as voles are forming bonds. And when we look at these areas, what we find is that they include these reward areas that we knew about, but they include a variety of other areas that are linked to the stress response and to the recognition of one another. And we think that we're starting to get some insight into just not only how does voles fall in love, but how it is those kinds of bonds might translate into changes in stress responses, which then might ultimately have lifelong impacts on health. And so we're hoping that we'll get some understanding of how the brain shapes the ability of relationships to govern our health and well-being. And this takes us back to Lorenz, because Lorenz not only recognized imprinting in geese as this kind of evolved response, but his work led directly to work on primates and work in social psychology and children raised in orphanages to realize that love is kind of an instinct for us. It's a characteristic of our species that's essential to how we function in the world. And before that there just wasn't that sense. That work that those ideas came directly out of animal literature. So what I want to leave you with today is this sense that this ability to form bonds is part of our biological legacy. It's part of what makes us human and part of what makes us uh, what enriches our experience. So with that, I'll stop and I'll gladly take questions.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, Steve. That was really interesting to talk about the neuroscience of bonding. And so now we're going to take some questions for you from the audience. So our first one is from Arthur, and he asks, scientifically, how are romantic bonds different from those with family or friends?
That is a wonderful question. So when we look at these networks of brain regions that are activated as prairie voles form bonds, they look very similar to the networks of brain regions that are important in parental care, very similar to networks of brain regions that have been implicated in social bonding. We don't know if there's a one-to-one correspondence of those, and probably there are going to be aspects of them that are unique, right? I mean, we know that the nature of the sexual relationship is different from the nature of a friendship, and different from the nature of a relationship with between parents and offspring. So there will be aspects that are unique, but overall, the involvement of these reward regions, the involvement of a number of other kind of emotional centers in the brain seems to be surprisingly similar across these contexts.
So Sarah, our next question is from Sarah, and she asks, does our virtual environment affect bonds?
Well, that is a little outside of my expertise, but I'll speculate if folks don't mind, which is just that, I mean, one of the bonds has, I think of bonds as being kind of these evolved behavioral strategies. And as such, there are a whole lot of ways that we communicate with each other to help maintain those bonds. And a lot of that communication involves, giving signals that indicate our interest in one another, and then reciprocating those signals if we receive them from somebody we care about. And those signals may be, saying "I love you." They may be very subtle things like the way you touch somebody on an arm, or the way you lean in when they speak. And some of those things are fine in a virtual world, but other things, particularly the things that involve touch, those are very much missing now. And even the things that are good in a virtual world are not quite as good as real life. I think we all agree.
Yeah, I think anecdotally we've all experienced that over the past year with the pandemic for sure. So our next question is from CD, who asks, does the brain differentiate between healthy bonds and unhealthy ones? Say like a food addiction, for instance.
Mhm. That's a great question. I think that I mean, I don't, again, there's so much to study that we don't know, but I think that in general, bonds have a common mechanism. But just like our relationship to other kinds of behaviors, like the food we eat, or other decisions we make, that those can be inappropriate, or maladaptive for some reason.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to think about that in terms of like dopamine, for instance, right? Because we know it's involved in both processes. So understanding
Yeah,
these common
absolutely.
and different mechanisms, I think, is an important question for us to
Yeah.
understand. So Kathleen asks one, maybe that's related to internet memes. She asks, can bonding occur across species? Can a person bond with their dog, right? Or how different is a bond between a person and an animal, between a human and another human?
That's a great example. So there was all this lovely work I think of it as being in the 60s and 50s, that was just sort of these anecdotal descriptions of what looked like bonds gone awry. So they talked about the broodiness of hens, and you could get hens to sit on baby kittens.
Right.
And of course, there are lots of, there are books on animal friendships, of bonds that have formed across species. And we have two dogs, and certainly, we form bonds with other species that tap into the same mechanisms. And we know that they're the same mechanisms because there's a researcher in Japan who's just done some beautiful work showing that when uh, dog owners and their pets share eye contact, they both get oxytocin release, this hormone that's important for bonding in humans and prairie voles, and most mammals, probably. Um, and he even finds that when pets and their owners are reunited, they both tear up. So
Hmm.
you don't necessarily notice that your dog tears up, but he's been investigating that as a more general mammalian phenomenon. He finds that moms, and that there are oxytocin receptors in the tear duct. It's pretty fascinating. I think that cross species bonds are just a really interesting example of something that our existing mechanisms for forming bonds has been bent for this new use.
I mean, I think it's fascinating to think about how much these mechanisms are preserved, right, from
Yeah.
across our species and represent
Mhm.
something that's common across all of us.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting question that Stephen asks. He wants to know whether we can maybe modulate these kind of bonding signals that you see with drugs. So if we give a drug that impact the neurotransmitters related to bonding, would that actually cause a more strong bond to be formed between individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think that I mean we know that under most circumstances, you wouldn't be able to do that with humans ethically. However, certainly in animal models, like in the variables, we can manipulate the capacity to form bonds by altering the abundance of these hormones or altering their ability to interact with the reward system that I talked about. Um, in humans, there are some interesting examples of clinical trials where folks have tried to use or are trying to use pharmaceutical compounds. There's one called melanotan that influences a hormone system called melanocortin that then in turn influences oxytocin with the idea of using it to modulate the stressfulness of social interactions in people on the autism spectrum to facilitate um, gaining social skills and things like that. So in principle, yes, it would be able to do
Yeah.
that spread.
So I think this is a very salient question that Keely asks. She asks, how does the brain process grief from the loss of a bond, right? Through either a breakup or a death of someone who you're bonded to.
That's a great question. And people, I mean, people are using parables to look at the effects of social isolation or grieving on health and longevity. Um, and I mean, there's a lot that we don't know, of course, but um, from a from a from a kind of comparative or evolutionary perspective, I think of grief as a logical or the anxiety you feel with social isolation as a logical consequence of the value of a bond, right? Bonds are to help you overcome adversity, but they're a kind of insurance policy.
Right.
And so if you lose that, it makes sense that you would feel grief um, and anxiety. But in terms of how that's happening in the brain, there are brain regions, like there's a brain region known as the bed nucleus of the striatum terminalis that actively suppresses the stress response. We find this brain region is like one of the most activated during bonding, and I think maybe that's a brain region that is helping to translate the identity of an individual into the suppression of the stress response, and presumably that's a component of grief. But yeah, that's kind of a big area that we're headed into next.
Yeah, I think so.
Map some of these circuits.
It's definitely a poignant question, I think. So this is our last question for you, Steve, which is from Devin. And she asks, are there any negative consequences of having too many bonds?
Yeah, well, I'm an extrovert, so I would say no. My husband's an introvert, and he would definitely have a different answer.
Yeah.
Uh, we don't know of any negative consequences for too many bonds, but there are trade-offs between the number and quality of bonds, particularly because there's a finite amount of time that you have to invest in the development and maintenance of bonds. And so I think that's probably really the only real negative consequence I could imagine.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. And your work is very important for us, understanding how, right, each of us experience our lives and those around us. So now we're going to hear from our second speaker, Lisa Neff, who's an associate professor of human development and family sciences at UT Austin, who holds the Amy Johnson McLaughlin Centennial Professorship in Home Economics. So Lisa, we're excited to hear about your work on love.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I'm very excited to talk with you. So in my lab, we conduct longitudinal studies of couples relationships, so both dating and married couples. And as part of these studies, we collect all kinds of data from couples every 6 months for as long as 4 or 5 years in order to better understand the factors that can promote versus hinder relationship success over time. And perhaps fittingly, given the times that we're living in, One focus of my research is on understanding the role that stress can play in shaping couples' relationship dynamics. Now, to say that the past year has been stressful would certainly be an understatement. As we all know, when the pandemic hit a year ago, many of us were suddenly faced with a slew of new stressors, things like working remotely, homeschooling kids, worrying about the health and well-being of loved ones, managing unexpected financial problems in the face of an uncertain economy. And to top it off, here in Texas, we're recovering from the recent snowpocalypse of 2021. So things have certainly been stressful. And perhaps now more than ever, many of us recognize the incredible importance of our relationships with loved ones for maintaining our happiness and well-being during difficult times. Unfortunately, research highlights a rather ironic fact, and that is, although our relationships matter more to us when we're experiencing stress, they might function worse because of it. And that is because of something known as stress spillover, which refers to the idea that stressors that we experience in other life domains, so things like work stress, perhaps the stress of caring for aging parents, tensions you may experience with your friends or coworkers, these stressors can carry over to affect the way we think and behave when interacting with our relationship partner. And so what I wanted to do today is just give a really brief glimpse into some of my work in this area, starting with some research that was conducted before the pandemic, and then ending with some initial data we have coming out of an ongoing study of couples' relationships that we've been conducting during the pandemic. So I mentioned that stress can affect the way we think in our relationships. And just to give one example of this, in one study, we were interested in understanding whether stress may alter what we attend to and notice in our relationship. So decades of research indicates that happy couples generally view their relationship through rose-colored glasses. In a nutshell, happy couples are really good at focusing their attention on their partner's positive traits and qualities while finding ways to overlook or diminish the importance of their partner's negative qualities. Unfortunately, stress can turn these rose-colored glasses a bit cloudy. And that's because research suggests stress can change the way we process incoming information. Specifically, stressed individuals are more likely to focus their attention on negative information more so than positive information. And the same seems to be true in our relationships. So in one study, we asked each member of the couple to report on how much stress they were experiencing in a variety of life domains. And then we also asked each member of the couple to complete a short questionnaire every day for 2 weeks, in which they reported on their own behaviors in the relationship that day, as well as their perceptions of what their partner did in the relationship that day. So in this way, we were able to compare individuals' perceptions of what their partner did to the partner's own reports of their behavior. And what we found was that those individuals who are experiencing more stress, so the more stress individuals reported experiencing, the more attentive they were, meaning the more accurate they were in tracking those day-to-day changes in their partner's negative behaviors. But they were less aware of their partner's positive behaviors, suggesting that stress might create an attentional bias toward negativity in the relationship. But in addition to influencing what we see, stress can also influence what we do. And that is because doing the right thing in your relationship, so things like biting your tongue when your partner snaps at you and not escalating that negativity, or perhaps giving your partner the benefit of the doubt and letting it go when the partner upsets you in some way. These kinds of healthy relationship behaviors have been shown to be more effortful to enact in that they require greater levels of self-control compared to more selfish or destructive behaviors. In other words, doing the right thing in your relationship is often hard work, but we also know that managing your stress is hard work as well. So to the extent that coping with stress is consuming your energy and resources, you may just have less energy for doing those good things in your relationship. And in fact, in many studies in which we track individuals over time, we have found that at times when individuals are experiencing increases in their stress, They report feeling more drained, burned out, exhausted, and that increases the likelihood that they're going to engage in negative communication and negative behaviors toward their partner. At times when their stress is lower, however, these same individuals behave much more positively. In fact, just to highlight how important stress is in shaping couples' relationship behaviors, my colleague Hannah Williamson did a study where she compared the effects of stress to other factors known to influence couples' behaviors. And she found that stress was a stronger predictor of negative communication than, for instance, childhood and family of origin experiences. So it was a stronger predictor than what individuals witnessed in the home growing up. Stress was a stronger predictor than individuals' qualities, such as their personality or depression levels. And it was a stronger predictor than their happiness in the relationship. So in study after study, what we see is that even those couples who generally exhibit good relationship skills, who seem to have the right tools in their relationship toolkit, even those couples can find it difficult to draw upon and use those skills at times when their stress level rises. So what does this mean for couples' relationships during the pandemic? Well, in thinking about the answer to this question, it's important to recognize that the pandemic is a really unusual stressor with some pretty unique qualities. So in non-pandemic times, research shows that our stress can color the way we think and behave in our relationship without our awareness. We're not always clued into the fact that our grumpy mood from work is affecting the way we're interacting with our partner in the home later that evening. However, the pandemic is pretty different in that it is a stressor that is highly salient, meaning I'm sure we're all aware that the pandemic is causing us stress and it's probably affecting the way we behave. It's a stressor that affects large numbers of people. It's a shared experience around the globe. And it's a stressor that is relatively uncontrollable. There's not much any one of us can do to directly fix the problem. And there's been research, for instance, research looking at couples' relationships in the aftermath of natural disasters like hurricanes, or research on couples' relationships during the stressful times of the Great Recession in 2008. And what that research suggests is that when the stressor has these qualities, meaning when the stressor is highly salient, when it affects large numbers of people and is relatively uncontrollable, those circumstances encourage individuals to blame the stressor for their relationship problems, as opposed to blaming their partner. And when couples blame the stressor for their problems, that tends to unite them. They're more likely to engage in proactive coping efforts, more likely to support each other in the relationship, which can make the relationship more resilient to the harmful effects of that stress. And so last spring, when the pandemic started, my colleague Marcy Gleason and I were very interested into whether a similar pattern might be emerging in the pandemic. So we collected data from couples in which we first asked them to report on the extent to which they blamed the pandemic, themselves, or their partner for their current relationship troubles. We then had them complete a short survey every day for 2 weeks, in which they reported on the amount of stress they experienced that day, as well as their thoughts and behaviors in the relationship that day. And so we found a couple of interesting things. So first, we found that individuals were, in fact, more likely to blame the pandemic for their current relationship troubles than they were to blame each other or themselves. More importantly, however, blaming the pandemic had some important protective effects. So what these graphs are showing you is if you focus on the solid lines, which represent days of high stress, versus the dotted lines, which represent days of low stress. What this is showing is that on days in which individuals reported more stress, they were less happy in the relationship, and they were more likely to exhibit negative behaviors toward their partner compared to those low stress days. However, if individuals blamed the pandemic for their relationship troubles, those harmful effects of stress were weakened. Now, interestingly, we did some follow-up data from this sample this past winter, so in November, December, because we wondered, as the pandemic wore on, might the protective effects of blaming the pandemic dissipate a bit? Might, it work when the pandemic was novel, but maybe it's not as effective as this pandemic persists. Well, encouragingly, we found that even 9 months into the pandemic, individuals were still more likely to blame the pandemic than each other, and it still seemed to have these protective effects for their relationship. So a little bit of optimistic news coming out of this work. But that is just a really brief glimpse into what we know about stress and relationship functioning. And when we think about that question of why is it that some relationships succeed and other relationships fail, I think the answer to that question is best summarized by this quote, suggesting that our understanding of relationship development and stability might be enhanced if we adopted the perspective of civil engineers, who typically calculate a structure's durability relative to the environmental forces it can withstand without disintegrating. In other words, if we want to understand why some relationships succeed and others fail, we not only have to know about the raw materials going into the relationship, we have to know about individuals' qualities, their personality, etc. We have to know about their relational qualities, trust, commitment in the relationship. But in addition to those raw materials, we have to understand the context in which that relationship is developing. Because sometimes even relationships that have good raw materials can start to erode if the environmental forces are strong enough. So again, that's just a little bit about our work in this area. I want to thank my colleagues who have collaborated with me in this area, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks so much. That was so compelling. I feel like I got personal life advice that I can make use of in my daily life with my own partner. So we're going to start taking questions from you, the audience, for Lisa. So Laura has our first question, and I think this is a really good one. When we're going through a hard time, what are some strategies we can use to encourage a bit better connection with our partner?
Absolutely. There are a few tips I would have. So especially thinking of what's going on now, I think we all need support from our partners. And so being aware when your partner is stressed out, cutting them a little bit of slack, recognizing that they may not be the best or most patient partner at that time, and finding ways to support them during that time to limit some of those stress spillover effects. I will say it can be a little bit tricky when both partners are stressed out. I certainly know some couples have made agreements that only one person's allowed to freak out in the relationship at any given day, and that can work out well because then the non-stressed person can help the stressed person. It is a little bit more difficult when both members are stressed, because we also find that when we're stressed, it can undermine our perspective taking abilities, and we might not be picking up on our partner's subtle cues that they want support. So I would say be as direct in your support needs as you can during those stressful times. Make it clear, what you need, what kind of support would be helpful to you, and don't expect your partner to be a mind reader, especially if they're going through their own stress and might have difficulty picking up on those cues. Another piece of information or a helpful tip I might suggest is try to the best that you can to infuse your relationship with everyday small positive moments with each other. So, in the pandemic, just things like taking a walk together, having a pleasant meal, playing a board game. A lot of times we look at those small moments and they can seem very trivial or inconsequential at the moment. But there's a theory, it's called the theory of emotional capital, which suggests that every time you share one of those positive moments, it's metaphorically like putting a coin in your emotional bank account for the relationship. So you're building resources for those tough times. So those positive experiences, though small, can accumulate. And research shows that couples who have accumulated more of those small positive experiences, when conflict happens, and it will happen, especially when you're trapped in a home with your partner for 9 months, then you're just less upset by those conflicts. They don't take as big a toll on the relationship than if you haven't accumulated that buffer of that emotional capital. So try to take time to infuse the relationship with those small positive moments as well.
Well, I wonder if those small positive moments are actually building the neural circuits that Steve talked to us about, that are actually they're helping form that bond that becomes resilient then in the times of stress.
Absolutely. I think there's absolutely something to that. And we've also found that, the more of those small positive moments you build, it just changes the way you view your partner. You're more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt when
Right.
they do something negative and all
Well,
those.
we have a
Yeah.
question along those lines. So
Okay.
Teresa asked us, how can we stop our stress from making us focus on our partner's negative traits?
That is a question that I perhaps don't have a good answer to. Well, I guess one answer is try to be aware. So, the last part on blaming the pandemic, a big theme out of that is when we become aware that we're stressed and you become aware that maybe that is affecting what you're doing in your relationship, we do tend to compensate. We tend to override those negative effects of stress. So, to the extent that you're aware you're stressed out, be mindful of the fact that you might be viewing your partner in a more negative light because of it, and try to adjust your behavior accordingly. That said, there's also research that suggests if the stress gets high enough, right? If your stress exceeds your coping capabilities, sometimes being aware isn't enough, right? You could be aware you're stressed out, but you still behave in that negative way. I can
There's nothing
say
you
from
can do about
personal
it.
experience that has happened to me. I can tell my partner exactly why I yelled at them, but I couldn't stop myself from doing it before, it happened. But so I would say, as a partner, if recognize that, when your partner is stressed, again, cut them some slack, recognize they may be viewing you a little bit differently, and try to be a little bit patient with them during those stressful times.
Awesome. So Melissa actually has a thought experiment for us, an idea, maybe a coping strategy. So she had seen a social media post about a couple creating a fake person that they used to blame their issues on when they were having actually their own relationship issues. And so she asked whether doing something like that example, creating a blame target, would actually be useful as having a pandemic, right? That you're talking about blaming things on the pandemic, but can you create an imaginary person that would help you negotiate these issues with your partner?
That's a great question. I'd love to see some, empirical research, but just,
Yeah.
off the cuff, I think it's an interesting possibility because, well, one, I think it, creates some humor in the situation
Right,
and perhaps
absolutely.
adds some levity, to, when things get heated. If you can, I have heard of couples that are like, we blame Joan, or, whoever this imaginary person is. It does sort of like cut the tension a little bit, which can allow you to have a more constructive conversation about the problem. So I think it could possibly help in terms of allowing for the couple to unite and support each other better if they can sort of have that little shift of blame. Absolutely.
So we have one final question from Sam, and they ask, can you talk about how mental health issues and trauma influence the dynamics of relationships?
Well, yeah, I don't know as much about trauma, but mental health, there is a lot of work looking at depression
Mhm.
and how it can be. Depression also is an important predictor of relationship processes, and so depression can take a toll on relationships in terms of depression. Depressed people act a lot like stressed people in that they are having a more negative filter in terms of what they see in the relationship. They might be engaging in more negative self-protective behaviors in the relationship as opposed to relationally oriented ones. And so it can make it more difficult for the couple in those cases. So depending on the level of depression, might want to work with a professional in terms of addressing some of those mental health issues. And again, helping the partner understand what your support needs are, like what are the struggles you're going through, and what kind of support is going to be helpful to you, to navigate those difficult situations.
And I think it's a lot of valuable advice. So I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today on our Texas Science Festival talk on the science of love. And of course, I want to give a big thanks to Lisa and Steve for their time, their knowledge, and their compelling presentations. I learned a lot today. So this is our last week of this Texas Science Festival, and the organizers are really welcome your feedback. So please make sure to take the survey that you'll receive by email. to share your thoughts and ideas for future Texas Science Festival events. We do have a number of events that are scheduled for the remainder of the week, and so to register for those, you can visit sciencefest.utexas.edu between now and Thursday at midnight. And as noted in the chat, if you have follow-up questions from today's discussion, you can email those to cnsdev@austin.utexas.edu. That's cnsdev@austin.utexas.edu. So thank you for your interest in Texas science, and we hope to see you virtually at future sessions.